apprehend these enormous narratives. So perhaps I can hand over to one of the editors of this, Lily Carr, who's going to talk a little bit about the project. Oh, sorry. Sorry, there you are, Alda. Can you hear me?
Hello.
Hello. Sorry, this is Alda Saxena.
Right?
Yes, who's joining us from Arizona. Hi, Alda.
Hi, Robert, and hi to all of you who are there. It's nice to be with you virtually this evening, and thank you so much, Robert, for your kind of introduction. I would also like to thank the organizers of the AMA event for the invitation to be here with you, at least virtually today. As you've just heard, my name is Alda Kellerman Saxena. I'm an environmental anthropologist based at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona, which is where I am speaking to you from now. I am also one of the editors of the Feral Atlas Project, which you will hear more about today, both from me and from my colleague, Lily Carr, who is there with you in person. Feral Atlas, the More Than Human Anthropocene, is a digital environmental humanities project, which was published in 2020 by Stanford University Press. You can see the landing page of the project on the screen, populated by a group of floating feral creatures. I will say more about them in a second. Although it is an academic publication, Feral Atlas is an online open access project, which means that you can visit it and look through it at your leisure without paying a fee. Perhaps some of you already have, and if not, I very much hope you will. The project brings together a series of stories that tell us something important about the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, as you may know, is a formal geological term under consideration by the International Union of Geological Scientists to describe the period of human-driven environmental disruption in which we are currently living. At the heart of Feral Atlas are some 79 field reports, or short vignettes developed by researchers, artists, and activists, which were chosen for the insight they shed on the intertwined social and ecological processes that have brought about the Anthropocene. The project makes a core argument, which I will describe in two parts. First, it argues that human-built infrastructures are a central cause of current Anthropocene conditions. We use the term infrastructure to refer to the concrete physical interventions that we humans make to change the landscapes around us. Some of the infrastructures we consider in Feral Atlas are concentrated in defined spaces, like roads, dams, or canals. However, others are dispersed but repeated across space and time. These dispersed infrastructural practices include, for example, the disposal of rubbish or the kinds of power generating infrastructures that light homes and businesses. The second part of the argument has to do with how such infrastructures have generated Anthropocene conditions. And this is where the more than human comes in. We argue that a key impact of human-built infrastructure emerges from its interactions with non-human entities. These entities may be living creatures, or they may be things that are non-living, but nonetheless lively, like microparticulate dust or discarded plastic. We call these more than human entities feral because their actions have escaped or exceeded the bounds of human design and control. In our definition, feral is not a cute and cuddly reclaimed term. We use it to describe entities which have noxious, damaging effects on their surrounding ecologies, making life unlivable for their neighbors. Let me show you what I mean. In a moment, we will play a 7-minute clip from the full-length film Albatross, which served as a touchstone for our editorial team as we were conceptualizing the project, and which the filmmakers were kind enough to let us include as one of our field reports. The film is a visual exploration of albatross ecologies on the island of Midway, and also of the damaging effects that the dumping of plastic in the oceans has on the lives of these birds. In the terms of Feral Atlas, the infrastructural action described here is the dumping of plastic refuse in the oceans, and the feral entity is the plastic itself. Please do go ahead and roll the film.
Kneeling over these scenes is like looking into a mirror. Here we face one surreal consequence of our collective choice. This is our culture, turned inside out. I was drawn to Midway because it offered a chance to face a global issue on a personal scale. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I came here as a witness, with no story or answers in mind. It was a time of year when the live birds are all out at sea. I never saw any of them. I experienced this island as a desolate and lonely place, permeated by tragedy. I made my series of photographs, said goodbye to the island, and returned home, thinking my project was finished and that I would never see Midway again. I couldn't have known then that I would be drawn to return here again and again, and that my experience here would change the way I see the whole world. And I never would have imagined that my guide on this journey would be a non-human being, a legendary seabird that we call the albatross.
I wanted to share this particular Feral Atlas entry with you today because for me it helps to position our project and the impetus behind it in relationship to the larger themes of care, repair, and healing. As you may anticipate from the opening shots, the full-length film goes on to tell the story of albatross life cycles and how these life cycles are disrupted when the birds unknowingly eat plastic that has been dumped in the ocean. Albatross, as we learned from the film, mate for life, and both the male and the female invest a great deal of time and care in raising their chicks, from egg to fledgling. Using the slow, lingering kinds of images you saw there at the end, the film follows a colony of albatross through a whole breeding season, leading to the awkward but triumphant first flights of most of the season's chicks as they head out to sea on their own wings. But these first flights are paired with scenes of the drawn-out deaths of those few chicks who are unable to get off the ground. These birds, like the lifeless bodies that open the clip you have just seen, are already weighed down by plastic in their bellies, which their parents have inadvertently fed to them, regurgitated from their own stomachs. Showing us this confronting reality, the film is both a slow-moving expose and a deep meditation on environmental grief. I wanted to talk to you about albatross as a starting point for today's conversation because of two realizations that seeing the film crystallized for me. These are themes which I think run throughout the Feral Atlas project and which are relevant to our larger conversation about care, repair, and healing in the face of environmental harm. When I first saw this film, I was deeply emotionally affected. After the lights went up, I sat in the theater and cried and couldn't stop thinking about it for several days after. I was admittedly susceptible to the way that the film weaves the fate of the birds into a narrative about parental care. My first child was, at the time, a little more than a year old, and I was perhaps particularly attuned to both the fragility of new life and the effort required to sustain it. But thinking with this narrative of care helped me to see a blind spot in the way we talk about the more than human world. And specifically, this is a blind spot that I think of as being rooted in a myth of interchangeability. When we think about other species and their fates, we are often taught to think of the individuals as interchangeable. This is the case, for example, in wildlife population biology, where we might think of the rise and fall of numbers of a particular species as being important, but no individual life or death merits more than passing consideration. But by emphasizing the arc of life and death of a few birds, Albatross points out the fallacy in this perspective. It encourages us to see each of these lives as meaningful, both innately and because of the way that it is tied to other lives. It also encourages us to mourn the loss of these lives deeply and with consideration. And the film also gives the lie to another form of interchangeability in the form of plastic. I don't know if you were drawn, as I am, to trying to identify those familiar plastic objects inside of the carcasses of the albatross chicks shown in the initial shots. When I look, I see bottle caps, toothpaste caps, toothbrushes, a hair comb, all objects that I touch daily and am responsible for disposing of nearly as often. I often think of these objects as being part of an economy with some circularity, or at the very least, containment. If they go to the rubbish bin, they should go to a dump and stay there. Or if I put them in the recycling, they should enter back into the system as new material. But as these stark images show us, so many of these objects do not stay put or get recycled. The bottle cap I threw out last week may well do harm to a bird or a fish or a whale next month. The scale and scope of this kind of dumping of plastic is now becoming evident, not only in the bodies of animals living in the ocean, but also organisms across the planet, and even in our own flesh. So this was the first crystallization for me, that thinking about creatures or pieces of plastic as if they were interchangeable and as if no individual entity mattered was in fact a gross disservice to life. And as I sat with this for a few days, a second thought became clear. I found that I felt deeply betrayed. Perhaps like many of you, I have considered myself an environmentalist since I was old enough to know what the term meant. I had memorized the chemical names for the different types of plastic, the different types of plastic recycling at around age 10. And a year or two later, I organized a bake sale to help save the Amazon rainforest. I have been at this for a very long time, and I somehow had believed that as long as many of us bonded together with the intent of doing good, we would make things better. But seeing the evidence that those intimate, familiar pieces of plastic had done such deadly harm made me angry in a way I had not felt before. In short, it made it clear to me that while I may still be responsible for my own individual actions through choices of what to purchase and what to throw away, our human-built systems are in need of a fundamental rethinking and restructuring if we hope to continue to live on an inhabitable planet. And these 2 points, that small things matter in big ways, and that our ways of interacting with the environment are due for a major overhaul, are impulses that run through the Feral Atlas project. The project examines some of these ugly stories of human-built infrastructure precisely with the purpose of shedding light on the broad ways in which our systems privilege human well-being, and the well-being of only some humans at that, to the expense of other landscapes and ecologies. By telling these ugly stories in a compelling way, we hope to be part of a larger conversation about how we might redesign our environmental interactions to prioritize mutual and widespread flourishing, not just for people, but also for our more than human fellow travelers. I will now turn to Lily Carr to let her say more about infrastructure, and also about some ways that you can start thinking about what more than human flourishing might look like in the places where you live.
Thanks, Alda. She'll be back. So I want to talk a little bit more about this map, which is perhaps a map that we will be more used to seeing, that accompanies the film Albatross on the Feral Atlas site. The map is kind of in the footnotes to the film, as it were. And it's a map that shows the extent of plastic spread throughout the planet's ocean systems, based on research that was only conducted in 2014. The plastic spread is expressed by the colored smear, and the dark red patches sort of in the centers, where plastic is at its most, marine plastic is at its most concentrated. And you can see them kind of located at the center of the major ocean gyres, which are these spots towards and around which the major ocean currents circulate. And we made this map, the Feral Atlas team, to try to express how it is that the plastic we humans release into the environment, so, by throwing it into the recycling bin, is uncontainable. And it's uncontainable because it so easily gets washed into drains, into rivers, into seas. It's a leaky object, a leaky substance. And in being washed by Earth systems, the action of the ocean currents carries it towards what are for us land dwellers some of the most remote parts of the ocean, but are in fact at the very centers. So the marine plastic that appears in Albatross is plastic carried and gathered and concentrated by non-human processes, by the very nature of the oceans. And I mean, I like facts, so to talk through the map a little bit more, in the dark red patch in the centers, there's the equivalent of about 3 plastic toothbrushes per size of ocean, the size of a public swimming pool. But these objects don't remain intact. They're also broken down, again, by the kind of the ocean systems as they go about their business. They're broken down by ocean currents and winds and waves and marine organisms into smaller and smaller pieces, down to the particles that are nanometers thick, which are the particles we eat when we eat fish. And the ocean gyres have been described in some reports as a chunky plastic soup, but they're more of an unstrained consommé of plastic. And I mean, the Albatross film for me, which also confronts me with a lot of very intense emotions, this map does something different. And I think the emotion it provokes is despair, because when seeing maps like this, it's so easy to think, or the thinking becomes, well, is the extent and magnitude of environmental harm overwhelming to the point of feeling quite paralyzed? But in the face of maps like this, we have to ask ourselves what can be done. Ocean cleanup efforts are one side, and another side, which is the side that Feral Atlas talks about, is to ask how uncontainable plastic is spread through the waterscape, landscape, and our own bodies in the first place. And to answer this, Feral Atlas starts with infrastructures and encourages us all to start with infrastructures. Feral Atlas asks us to watch carefully what imperial and industrial infrastructures do. That is, what physical, spatial, material actions are these infrastructures making on water, on air, on land? And what material and spatial changes are they making to water, air, and land? On the screen is what we in Feral Atlas called a sound and video poem, though without sound, so you have to go onto the Feral Atlas site for that. But it's a video poem because Feral Atlas uses it to express, or uses it to try to express gesturally and physically and to some extent sensorially what it is that infrastructures do. So in these videos, it's the action of dumping. Dumping is an action that imperial and industrial infrastructures do again and again at all sorts of different scales and places and durations and times in different forms. But dumping isn't a mistake or a design flaw. The infrastructures that we are talking about require dumping as part of their proper functioning. Think how normal it is to dump trash in landfill or dump household and industrial chemicals down drains, dump nuclear waste in storage facilities designed to last generations, and dump overburden from open cast coal mines. And with each of these dumpings, which are the physical material alterations of landscapes are radically transformed. And together with the actions of non-humans who are encouraged by this landscape transformation, they together make the radical ecological changes that Feral Atlas talks about, tipping landscapes from one state to another. And these are the world-ripping ecological effects that Feral Atlas is concerned with. Through the sheer power of their actions, infrastructures rip apart social and ecological systems and create new ones. So, although dumping is a familiar and normal infrastructural action, what dumping normal infrastructural action for the imperial and industrial infrastructures that we have all come to depend on, what dumping does and what it helps transform is specific according to place. And in doing so, it turns familiar places into places that are perhaps shockingly unfamiliar. These video poems have been shot in places quite remote from where we are now, literally now in Berlin. The ones we saw at the beginning were shot in Spain. And they show dumping in highly visible forms. But the action of dumping they describe can be observed all around us. Dumping is part of the normal functioning of the imperial and industrial infrastructures. As I said, we are all very much dependent on. Around this time last year, one of the Feral Atlas editors and I, Feifei Zhou, conducted a workshop at the ZKM in Karlsruhe. And together with a group of 8, we tried to notice and attune ourselves to the sights and sounds of infrastructural work in the places where we live, using Feral Atlas's sound and video poems as a guide. At this point, it was peak lockdown, so we were all zooming in remotely. And we each took a walk around our own neighborhoods, which was a good excuse, actually, to get outside. And this is a board which gathers some of the recorded observations and retellings of observed infrastructural work in action from the workshop group. You can see that dump does not appear. Actually, that proved the hardest action to capture, which I think speaks to the privilege of where we are able to live. But there are other actions here that infrastructures also do as part of their normal functioning. And Feral Atlas recognizes these actions as actions that also radically transform landscapes materially and physically. Infrastructures take materials and organisms from one place for use in another, which introduces new species and new socialities to local systems and changes their ecology. Infrastructures burn, chemically transforming matter to create the energy that sustains our ways of life, and in the process also creating the harmful and climate-changing byproducts of fossil fuel combustion. Infrastructures also grid, ecologically simplifying landscapes and isolating specific species for ease of management and control. And such isolation nurtures pests and pathogens. Infrastructures also crowd, densely packing enclosed places with humans or non-humans, making it easier for pathogens to spread. And crowding also includes the crowding and concentrated of chemicals in an environment, elevating them to the status of toxin. Infrastructure is also smooth, leveling ground for ease of governance, and speed, aiding the passage of industrial vehicles. And infrastructure is also pipe, extracting and distributing the oil, water, and energy that sustain our ways of living, whilst depleting them and depriving other places of them. And each of these action words that the Feral Atlas team came up with are designed to draw our attention to the sheer brute force of everyday infrastructural work, because it's this work over and over and over again that transforms landscapes in such radical material ways, and in doing so, encourages the out-of-control, world-ripping, ecologically transformative effects, which are the effects that cause great harm. And there are other action words that could also be used to express the work of infrastructures. Digging, piping, draining are some, there are more. The point is not to learn what it is that infrastructures do. The point is really to learn to notice what it is that infrastructures are doing in our own environments, because it's only in noticing can we start to take care and perhaps question what they're doing. We don't have time to take a walk around the streets of the Gropius Bow, which we would do if I could, and also if the weather wasn't terrible, to try and observe together infrastructural works in action, really outside the doors here. But let's try a small exercise anyway. I'd like to invite you to close your eyes or sort of turn inwards for a second and cast your mind to the place where you live and a daily walk you might take in your neighborhood. Can you recall any infrastructural works in action in these scenes? Can you recall their sights and sounds or smells? Try to imagine the repetitive action of these works over and over again, and hold that there in your mind. Now, can you imagine what non-humans may benefit or even flourish from the landscape and airscape and waterscape and soundscape transforming works you are thinking of? Can you imagine how the flourishing of this critter may benefit or be detrimental to others, other species, other landscapes, other cosmologies? This is much easier to do in a landscape and walking around and sensing than in a cinema. But before I pass you back to Alda, the question I want to leave you with is this. What social and ecological systems are you a part of? Alda, I'm bringing you back.
Thank you, Lily. To round out from what Lily has just shared and encourage you to consider yourselves, there are 3 points we would like to leave you with. I will describe these now, and to follow on to the exercise that she has just led you through mentally, we've also posed these in the form of questions that you could add to an exercise like that on the slide you see on the screen. So the first of these points is that while Feral Atlas argues for a fundamental and systemic rethinking of infrastructural work, it also argues that this kind of rethink must not be a top-down uniform process. Place-based action taken by individuals and small groups is still, perhaps more than ever, critically important. Many of the issues that make the Anthropocene unlivable will not be solved in seats of government or through accords made at international conferences. The results of the current climate conference, even if they are, as we can all hope, robust and definitive, will still not resolve issues of stream contamination or remove plastic refuse from the oceans. For repairing these kinds of environmental harms, we need the actions of many, many people, closely observing landscapes that they care about and taking steps to bring about change. A second point to take home is that environmental harm does not emerge in isolation from social injustice. Often, the same impulses that allow us to dismiss some species or landscapes as not worth protecting are aligned with the impulses that allow for discrimination against or oppression of certain groups of people. Because social justice and environmental justice are inextricably intertwined, we would argue that healing should not just be about healing relationships with more than human communities and ecologies. It is also critical that this work should involve repairing and rebuilding human relationships, even, and perhaps especially, across lines of race, class, and historical injustice. A last point to consider is that we should all develop a healthy skepticism of one-size-fits-all solutions, or claims that a particular technology will easily scale up. Thinking with the history of built infrastructures demonstrates that much of our current mess comes from grand-scale projects or scaled-up technologies which have been implemented without careful consideration of their localized environmental effects. This does not mean that one should never accept someone else's suggested solution for a localized environmental problem, but it does underscore the importance of asking a lot of questions before implementing a tool, technology, or approach that has only been proven elsewhere. Being vigilant about what infrastructural projects mean for specific local ecologies, for the places we live in and love, is critical to encouraging more than human thriving. Thanks for your attention. I will stop here for the moment, and I am very much looking forward to our discussion.
Okay, so thank you very much for that presentation, Olga and Lily, and for that wonderful introduction to everything that Feral Atlas is. And I wonder if we could start off by a lot of the work around Feral Atlas is mapping or considering this immense thing called the Anthropocene. And Olga, I wonder if you could start by trying to talk a little bit about what that really is.
Certainly. Maybe I'll start with just a little bit, and you can prompt me if you think we should continue farther. The Anthropocene is a term that has been coined to describe a proposed new geological era. I think I mentioned in the introduction that it's a term under consideration by the International Union of Geological Scientists. There's an Anthropocene working group, which is affiliated with that larger group, which is trying to work through this question and figure out what the right stratigraphic signal, what the right signal that you can see in layers of rock would be to define this new era where human actions have had a decisive impact on the Earth and its systems. But more broadly than that, this idea of the Anthropocene, of a time that is defined by human influence, I think it's really been taken up, especially in the social sciences and the humanities, as a sort of heuristic device for trying to think about what is this time period that we're living through, and how should we relate? How should we think about how humans relate to the planet, and how should we concretely change those relationships?
And when you think about the Anthropocene, when do you date that to? We talk about this era, and well, I'll add my own prompt here, which is that in our discussion you started talking about it as to do with the date of 1492, which of course is the date of first contact with indigenous worlds. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about why you choose that date.
That's right. Thanks for the prompt. So there, as I mentioned, there are the Anthropocene Working Group is considering stratigraphic signals. They're considering the kinds of chemical signals that you can pick up in layers of rock. And there have been a whole range of these starting points that have been proposed, ranging from early agriculture many thousands of years ago to more recent signals from the the nuclear testing and the detonation of nuclear bombs in the mid 20th century. And then also plastic, here we are again with plastic, as a sort of defining signal that spread from pole to pole, and that also you can date to the mid 20th century. Last I read up on this, which was recently, those two signals were the ones that the Anthropocene Working Group thought had the best evidence to support them as a start point for the Anthropocene, so nuclear radiation and plastic. But in putting together Feral Atlas, we actually chose a different starting point, which had also been considered as part of this list of potential stratigraphic indicators. The specific time period that it refers to is 1610, when you can see a carbon minima, a low point in the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere, and you can see that in stratigraphy. But the sort of cause of that carbon minima dates back to the encounter between Europe and the Americas in 1492, when Columbus and his ships arrived in the Bahamas and started interacting with indigenous peoples. And as many of you probably know, that interaction didn't just bring people face to face. It also brought diseases. It brought germs, viruses, including yellow fever, smallpox, and the measles. And in fact, long before Europeans began to sort of colonize the continent in mass numbers, those diseases had spread throughout North and South America, and had killed, I think 90% are the estimates of the indigenous population of the Americas at the starting point of colonization. So what happened that then produces that carbon minima in the stratigraphic layers of rock is that as people have died, they stop farming the lands that they had previously farmed, and those lands become reforested and absorb carbon from the atmosphere. This is a really stark historical example, and I think it's particularly stark in the moment we're living in on what is hopefully the tail end of the coronavirus pandemic. It's, I think, very vivid to imagine right now what that must have been like for the people who died and the people who lived through it. It is also, I think, a critical moment for thinking about the intertwining of social and environmental processes, and the way that those have been shaped in this period that we might think of as the Anthropocene.
One of the things that really strikes me looking at the work, the Feral Atlas, which is kind of on the border of an artwork, an activism, a pedagogical project, a repository of knowledge, but it's this insistence on situated knowledges, which I think is a term Donna Haraway coined. And in fact, she said when she said that she was inspired by Octavia Butler, the African American sci-fi writer who I think wrote a lot while traveling on buses across LA. So it's kind of highly situated milieu she was working in. But you're very much like on the ground, and that's what Donna Haraway was thinking. She's writing against this kind of big picture gaze from nowhere. That's the purportedly objective view of science. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about this idea of scale, and it's something that Anna Singh writes about as well, of course, in the mushroom. This idea of scalability, the macro big picture view. I'm conscious, of course, of COP26 and big targets, big numbers versus these on the ground apprehensions of what's going on in terms of climate change and other processes, of course.
Maybe I'll start, and I'd like to hear what Lily has to say about that too. So I know this is something she thinks very critically about, but I think the question of scale to my mind, also raises questions of fallibility, of human fallibility. So to sort of move away from thinking about these kinds of small and distributed infrastructural practices, and we can think about instead large-scale infrastructural interventions, like piping all the water from one part of a landscape to another part of the landscape, or building roads or strip mining. These are often processes that are thought about with a sort of set of grand designs in mind, but whether by omission or just failing, we often don't think about the potential unintended consequences of those kinds of designs, or the risks of doing something so big, and the scope of the consequences that could come from it. I look at the climate change negotiations that are going on right now. I'm paying attention to them, and I'm feeling hopeful, but also I think, like many people, feel a sort of healthy dose of skepticism about the kinds of solutions that might emerge or that might be agreed upon to be implemented worldwide. And I think there's a tension there that is important to sit with, even if it can't be resolved.
Lily, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I can add something. I should say that I'm coming from architecture, so quite a pragmatic, a different approach to Alda, who's in anthropology. But I've been thinking about scale recently because I've been based in Dessau, which at the Bauhaus, and we're looking at the kinds of landscapes Bauhaus, as in when it was built in the 1920s, is part of. And I didn't know this, but at that time, just south of Dessau, so between Halle and Leipzig, and a town called Bitterfeld, was the center of open cast brown coal mining in East Germany. And on the top of brown coal mining was built the electrochemical industry. And a result of over 100 years of intense kind of industrial processes, the landscape, like literally the land, air, and water there, has been transformed again and again and again. And these architects were there at the Bauhaus in the midst of all of this, which is irrelevant for the purposes of this conversation. But the town Bitterfeld was really the center of this, and this is where the electrochemical industry was. And I mean, all of the processes we talked about were going on there. There was the pumping of groundwater away in order to mine the coal. Then there was the dumping of chemical waste from industry back into the open cast pits. Then there was the kind of re-leveling of the surface post-unification in the 90s in order to kind of make those landscapes disappear. But under the ground, there is this very intensive, highly toxic, I've had it described to me as a bubble of contaminated groundwater that's really sitting beneath places where, such as Berlin, it's really just down the road, where people are living. And I had the pleasure of speaking to a man who'd lived there for 30 years. He was the former director of the film museum there. And he was talking about how, because, he wants to live there, we want to live for, the next generations and generations in this place. The only thing really to do is to take care of this bubble of highly toxic contamination. And there have been, since the 90s, there have been various kind of top-down attempts at remediating this contamination. And they've all failed because the extent of the problem is just too big. There is no one solution that can solve it. And so now what there is kind of like, you'll have to go to Bitterfeld to find more. They're having a cultural festival next year, and you could find out about some of the practices that they're engaging with to take care of this bubble. I only know if there are a couple of technical approaches, but there are other approaches too. And I think these places kind of living with the toxicity that we ourselves have created I mean, these places are everywhere. We're all living with them and next to them. And the question is really, what do we do? And I think living with it, you realize there is no one solution.
And you were saying that it's very difficult to think of a top-down solution, that the way people are observing it is via what's going on in their garden and stuff like that, very like in these highly localized, incredibly specific.
Yeah, I mean, there's a particular monitoring system that's designed to notice certain chemical traces, but of course, there's a lot in this ground, and which is constantly transforming and metabolizing. There are microorganisms down there, so other forms of paying attention, being attentive to it, are also important. I mean, at the moment, yeah, you can't grow food, but even just observing. And the man I spoke to, he's talking about, how in the course of his 30 years living there, he's kind of noticed shifts in the patterns of kind of butterflies and dragonflies and plant life that have sort of occupied again this landscape that was radically transformed, and sustained kind of tuning into these small things. This takes us to gardening, but we don't have to go there.
And this sustained tuning in, Older, that's something that you've thought and written about a lot, this kind of what you call long-term listening, and talking about really, through your work as an anthropologist, really trying to understand, what it is to have your feet on the ground in this particular place. But then how does the problem of relating that to big data work? You've talked about how climate science struggles to not correlate. I guess it does correlate to events, but to bring some sort of causative argument to these events. I mean, it's an ongoing problem.
Let me think about the right point of entry to respond to that. I think that's we had long conversations at the beginning of putting together the Feral Atlas project about the extent to which climate change should feature at all as a process that we talked about in Feral Atlas, and we sort of put that all on a shelf at the beginning and tried to look at lots of different kinds of environmental processes and environmental harms, lots of feral entities that were not climate related. And of course, in that process, we found many that were sort of spurred on by changing climate, and that let us bring climate back into the conversation to some degree. But I think there are sort of two thoughts that that your prompt brings to mind. One is the extent to which we all live sort of situated lives, and I think the way we can think about an environment that's an abstract thing. We can think about the environment or the planet or the globe, but concretely, there's surroundings that we interact with. It's the air that we breathe and the food that we eat, and the ground that we walk on. And there are so many processes of care and repair that could take place or need to take place. There are also lots of processes of things that are thriving and living and growing, and that things that are going right. But we experience all of that from a very situated perspective. And I think part of what we wanted to do in the project was to bring that situated perspective to looking at some of these sort of ugly environmental stories in a way that would take us away from some of the kind of global imagery of climate change. I think the second piece of that maybe is thinking about sort of like the way that the story of climate is told. It does often have a disconnect from what we live on a day-to-day basis, and I think that may be changing. It may be changing for people who are university students now, for example, or it may be changing for all of us after these last couple of summers of extreme temperatures and weather-related disasters. I'm thinking about the flooding that happened in Germany this last year, and I'm also thinking about extreme heat that took over in the Pacific Northwest, which is where I grew up, the Pacific Northwest of the United States. So it may be that there are ways for people to sort of connect these larger patterns to our own places and meaning making, the way that we make meaning around the life that we live, in ways that are a little more concrete. But I think people make meaning around so many different kinds of things. We make meaning around our families and around our schools and around institutions we may be associated with, whether those are museums or churches or sports teams. And connecting up all of those processes of meaning with these larger questions of kind of global climate, I think has historically been difficult. Maybe one of the positive and intended side effects of the fact that we're all feeling climate change now is that it also becomes more personally meaningful and spurs us to action.
And one of the things that I loved, like reading Anna Singh's book, which revolves around the mushroom. I'm sure people here are probably mostly familiar around this matsutake mushroom. But I loved your writing, Olga, around a potato in Bolivia and how the Andean farmers who were suffering from some of the effects of climate change, and how this became more of a political, an entangled, politicized narrative. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that as a field report.
Certainly. So my research is in Bolivia, in the Bolivian Andes, and when I'm not thinking about feral entities, I think about native and traditional crops, including lots of different kinds of things that people eat. But those purple potatoes, purple and red potatoes, are kind of the iconic crop to think with. And the entry that I wrote for the Feral Atlas Project was about that, and also about the relationship between potatoes and pests and diseases. And what is happening in the place where I worked under changing climatic conditions is that the seasons are becoming less and less reliable. They're sort of, rainfall is shifting and consolidating. So rather than being spread out, the total amount of rainfall remains about the same, but rather than being spread out over 3, 4, 5 months, it's coming in these big gushes, all concentrated around 1 or 2 months of the season. And what that has meant is that whereas farmers used to plant potatoes maybe 4 times a year, they've now really circumscribed their planting to 1, maybe 2 seasons. And the potatoes that they can plant in those seasons are largely commercial potatoes. There's also something that's happened with the way that the timing of the rainfall has worked that makes their environments much more fertile for the emergence of pests and diseases. One that is a real problem for these farming communities is called tison, which is the same word is used for early and late potato blight, but it's the one that caused the Irish potato famine. It's that same species. And many of the potatoes that people are planting in this one very concentrated season they're more resistant to blight because they've been formally bred in local institutions, whereas those beautiful small purple potatoes, which haven't undergone as much formal breeding for resistance to pests and diseases, are not as resistant. So you have this sort of convergence of factors that are spurred in part by climate change, but also have to do with commercialization, land concentration, and to some extent also the trade of different potato varieties, which also bring viruses and other diseases along with them into this area, that make it much more difficult for farmers to plant and successfully harvest the native and traditional potato varieties from the region. It's another sad story, unfortunately. There are happy pieces to it, I think, also largely coming down to the the determination of people who care about these kinds of potatoes and who like to eat them to continue planting them. And often that comes down to not whole communities, but just individuals who feel some passion about particular kinds of food or particular things that they remember eating, or just a commitment to having some kind of diversity in their fields. Those are the happy pieces of the story, but the bigger picture is that it's quite difficult.
And one of the things that struck me from your field report also was some of your earlier reporting from Mexico, where, and it struck me that your mistrust of big narratives, or skepticism around big narratives, because you were saying there was a government initiative that helped certain farmers but didn't help others, and in fact drug cartels were stepped in and actually saved some of those people from precarity. So it's the way, as you said, it's a question of mistrusting of does one thing work for everybody, which is almost certainly not going to be the case.
And that actually, it brings up a question about the extent to which our systems, our government systems, are enabled to deliver the governance that they promise. I haven't spent time doing field work in Mexico for about a decade, so I don't want to malign the current government. But at the time that I did research in Mexico, I lived there for a couple of years and did field work there for a few more years than that. It was really the case that what was written on paper about what people should receive or have access to receiving was not, it bore variable resemblance to what was actually available to them. So that's the kind of scenario that you see where other institutions step in, and the drug cartels in northern Mexico had, and probably continue to have, an incentive to build relationships with communities that would then, allow for complicity and silence in other illegal activity. So in a roundabout way, I think it does bring in these questions of strengthening governance, whether that's through a decentralized system or a centralized system. I think that probably varies from place to place, but finding ways to make certain that the great ideas that people write down on paper can actually happen on the ground.
And Lily, I want to ask you about some of the possibilities of the Feral, or what Feral Atlas aims to do on a formal level. And every report begins with some sort of map, or contains some sort of mapping. And there was a quote that struck me very much. When surveying a map, the question must always be asked, whose point of view and what kind of power does it assert? As Sylvia Winter has described, Western cartography provided a spatialized schema that facilitated the extractive, exploitative, and genocidal projects of colonialism. And it strikes me that your mappings and visualizations are always dynamic. They're like to do with flows, blockages, different. They kind of try to give different scales and rhythms, and how perhaps you could talk a little bit about the way that the things they're trying to capture by that approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think we saw with Albatross, different, formalistically different maps, like whether they're videos or kind of bird's eye view line drawings or soundscapes or songs or stories, like they all can have the capacity to tell different things. And there was a very conscious effort within the Feral Atlas team at the very beginning to not just include one kind of map that's this kind of schematic view of a territory with a kind of geolocated point on it, because actually that just covers up all the things that you really need to know about that place and the dynamics of what is going on there. And dynamics is a really good word because it kind of speaks to actually what is important, and it is the very lively movements of all of these activities both our human and non-human activities that are busy making worlds. In the Feral Atlas case, and when we're talking about environmental harm in a lot of terrible ways. And how do you capture dynamics in a way that is also able to be told and sort of communicated and acted upon across disciplines? And again, I think the kind of multitude of media, which is coming from a multitude of perspectives, helps to kind of, again, we're back to this notion of like attunement. Like, how many different ways do you hear something before it kind of clicks? And this is where this kind of diversity of tellings becomes really important in Feral Atlas. And sorry, I kind of went in two ways there at once. One is how do you work kind of across disciplines, and the other is what kinds of media and medium are we using? And there's a whole conversation here to be had about, like how the visual materials and other kind of media materials we do directly kind of then have an impact back on the places that we are describing. I mean, maps have been used for imperial, colonial purposes.
And it's dealing with this sort of enormous problem that the Anthropocene is, like Timothy Morton says, the Anthropocene is an example of a hyperobject, something that's so immense that you can't really frame it conceptually or sensorially. And it's interesting just even thinking about these kind of small situated experiences. There's different, like in the Albatross film, there's a point he makes that the birds probably experience time differently from the way that we do. It's much speeded up, and you feel like a little an albatross, like whose time scale really matters. Is it the dragonflies you were talking about earlier? Is it the birds? Is it ours? Is it the changing soil elements in a landmass? And one of the things that I think is very beautiful on the site is the way that it brings in all these other sensory areas into play. Like, for example, the sound of what is it? It's you play the sonic disturbance of. It's an air gun used for fracking, which is incredibly evasive for marine mammals, for example. And so you try to talk about that in terms of flows and the ways that this disrupts these flows.
I mean, I think you kind of put your finger on it when you was talking about cycles and rhythms. And actually, Robert, you said something earlier, not in this room, about, again, referring back to albatross and how, these birds don't know what they're feeding their young because they have a trust in the oceans to provide that food. And that trust is based on kind of centuries of ancestral knowledge. But we've changed the materiality of the oceans really quickly. And, it's that kind of suddenness and that quickness that is so violent and so destructive, and that is overwhelming to the point where whole worlds are destroyed. So yeah, timing is a really important feature in the Atlas. I don't know if you want to talk more.
Right. And so on top of these, this enormous repository of massively localized and situated reports, you put various, of course you have to organize this information somehow. And so you have these four big kind of mapping tools, perhaps we could call it, which are capital, empire, acceleration. Is it invasion is the fourth one? Yes. And so why did you choose, how did those categories come into being?
I remember how we came up with the word for them. And that may have been part of how they came into being. Anna, seeing if she were here, would probably also want me to emphasize that these categories are meant to be playful and not sort of definitive and hard around the edges. But we wanted to find a way to think about historical processes that wasn't just about timeline of this date and then this thing and this date and then this thing. So those four categories, invasion, empire, capital, and acceleration, are processes which have, they're historical processes which have a sort of rough periodization. Invasion is talking about contact between mostly Europe and the Americas, but other parts of the world also. Empire is talking about the processes that took place under the auspices of the colonial empires. All of this in the last 500 years. So that's the large scale periodization. Capital, of course, associated with the effects of the rise of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. And then acceleration is a term that has been used to describe this sort of onrushing of environmental and social change that has happened since the beginning of the 20th century. And we tried to think about how to describe those, because those processes have taken place at different moments in different places. So for example, we might take 1492 as a start date of invasion in the Americas, invasion of European colonizers of the continent. But that process would have started in the 1800s if we look at Australia. But then if you look at those two processes and the kinds of effects that they had on both indigenous peoples and local ecologies, in fact, there are big similarities. So we've thought about these processes somewhat playfully as historical detonators, as sort of detonating moments that, you can think of little explosions that go off in different places and then set something off afterwards. And the idea of those detonators served as also as a sort of starting point for what we might think of as a mapping device, but it's more. There are four pieces of art that were made by Feifei Zhu, who's one of the other editors of the Atlas, which are these large sort of mural scope digital drawings of the worlds created by those processes they take pieces of things that happened during those periods in different places around the world and try to sort of mix them together in a way that lets you visualize what that process looked like. We didn't include a visual of that in what we were presenting today, I think, because we wanted to focus in so closely on infrastructure. But I really think
I'm sure people
they're
will
quite
find
compelling.
it.
So
Yeah, that's great.
I hope people will take a look.
I'm noticing, sorry, that we're running out of time. So do we have time for a quick couple of questions? Does anybody have any questions they'd like to? Okay, well, in fact, I would like to very quickly ask this question that we mentioned last time, which is that one of the things you mentioned is that Anthropocene and your editorial consensus was that you don't want to overemphasize human ingenuity, and a lot of the stories, as we saw in the Albatross film, are quite brutal. And how that was a deliberate decision, really, to try to frame things in a certain way. I mean, of course, it's a very aesthetically beautiful film. It's heartbreaking and brutal as well, though.
It was a deliberate decision, and we owe that, I think, largely to Anna, who made the observation, which I think is right, that especially social scientists, especially anthropologists and our allies, really like to wrap up our stories with sort of a happy focus on the potential for human creativity and ingenuity to let us work our way out of things. And you can trace that back to the early days of sociology. I think Durkheim's book on religion ends with something similarly celebratory of the human spirit. But Anna, I think, rightly pointed out that part of what that leads us to is to sometimes look away from the ugly stories before we've fully absorbed them. And to the extent that grief and sadness can then serve as a spark for new forms of action. So here we go. We're coming back to creativity and ingenuity. That to the extent that kind of grief can serve as a spark for creativity, I personally found that to be actually a really productive choice.
Great. I'm sorry, the lady's just put her hand up, but I think we are really out of time, and we're fiercely under the cosh for timekeeping, I'm afraid.
I'm bracing for the gong.
Oh, sorry, really? It's a red light, isn't the red light?
Oh, and
But we can maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay, all right, somebody's handing the mic. Okay, sorry, misinforming you.
I just wanted to let you know about the initiative that I saw at the Venice Biennale for Architecture called Future Assembly, which is relatively similar to what you're doing, except that it's somewhat user-generated as well. And I was unfamiliar with how this is put together. If you're seeking collaborations with footage or radio programs or things that have, as you say, been observed over the last decades to compare culturally with what's happening now. Thank you.
so our project, because, thank you for asking a question. The our project actually, because of the stipulations of academic publishing, we had to cut it off at a certain point to the entry of new material. Our very patient and kind editor at Stanford said, now it needs to be done, so that she could, send it to her team and have them help us package it and get it out the door. Those kinds of conversations, though, I think are exactly what this project wanted to sort of be part of, and not, of course, Sparkle by itself, but help to turn along. So appreciate that recommendation to look, and I'll remember it.
It's called Future Assembly, and it's put together by Olafur Eriksson and a bunch of people in Berlin, and it was at the recent Biennale in Venice, and it's a huge project, actually. So do have a look. Thank you.
That's great. Okay, thank you. If there's no more questions, then I'm just going to say thank you so much for your participation, your presence here. It's been great. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. It was a real pleasure.